really do. We undersell the real world, and we think that it has to be this cruel and unjust place that's waiting to devour our children when they get there. And the real world can be cruel and unjust, but I didn't become a teacher so that I could just simply get my students ready for living in a cruel and unjust world. I became a teacher so that I could prepare my children to become democratic citizens to make the world a better place. So, if you think about the argument there, it's almost like it's saying the world's rough on people, get the kids ready. But that's kind of like saying, there's a lot of pollution in the world, so let's fill the classrooms full of pollution to get the kids ready for breathing all of the pollution in. I guess we could spend our time and effort just simply getting the kids ready for it, or why don't we educate them to try to make the world a better place? I mean, his comments about communism is a caricature critique of what's really going on here. It's more than over the top. I want school to improve, but that means school has to change. But that means that when we talk about school, we have to resist the temptation to simply object to changes in school only because we don't recognize it anymore. Because we all went to school, we all think we're kind of experts on it. We've all experienced it. Mm-hmm. So when we hear the schools are doing things differently than we went, we tend to object only because it's uncomfortable or it's not recognizable. But if we stop and actually look at the research and look at the reasonings behind some of the changes, while they might be not intuitive, they do make a lot of sense.
Well, what other fundamental changes should be made then? If we're looking to better the education of our kids. You touched on studying math for 12 years. Mm-hmm. You weren't a big fan of math. It really has nothing to do with your chosen profession now. Is part of the, adjustment in teaching our kids to allow them to succeed where they have passion? That is to say, you take math up to a certain stage in your life, and then maybe in high school you're like writing poetry. You're a writer. Well, let Johnny write some poetry. He can spend time away from some Pythagorean theorem.
I think there's some validity to having some degree of core curriculum that does need to exist to a certain point. I don't think within any culture we need a core basic
to a degree,
of course. Yeah. When we start to make flexible decisions about you can choose to do math or you can choose to do something else. For instance, I believe there's a real value in math. Don't get me wrong. I wasn't a fan, but it does teach you different ways of thinking. Okay, but the question always comes to math teachers, and any math teachers in the audience tonight would be able to field this question far better than I is. Why am I doing this? When am I ever going to use geometry in real life?
I still ask that question.
And I wonder that question myself. I cannot tell you what an isosceles triangle really is. I'm sure other people could.
Sure,
what it applies to.
We are sort of in an isosceles.
There you go.
Oh, this is an isosceles triangle. Okay, now I get it. Real life practical application.
Sure.
But I want to go back to one of the comments Joe made, because I think it's really important, is that the idea of making changes in schools is something I mentioned earlier we need to be mindful of, we need to be thoughtful about. When we hear about change, it becomes a big deal. One school in Calgary has made one change in policy, and it's a big news story. And while that's great, I think it's great that we're talking about education in a public forum. Yeah. I'm also a bit disappointed that it becomes such a big deal. Why is this such a big deal? We're removing academic awards.
Kind of give it a shot and see what happens.
Let's hold off in terms of having a sort of a knee-jerk, screaming, meaning reaction to this, and just pull back and say,
watch them as a model and see what happens.
Let's see what happens, because there's schools in the States and there's other schools in Canada who followed similar models, and there's a big hubbub for a year, and then everything goes back to normal and everything's good.
Yeah.
When it comes to change to education in Alberta, I give full credit to the government's inspiring education movement. And it's really it was started by the previous education minister, Dave Hancock, and he went around the whole province asking Albertans, what do you want from our education system? And what they came up with was a really solid document about what really truly matters to education. And I'll tell you, in that document, and I've read it very closely, nowhere in it does it say that from Albertans that what we really need is more honors rolls and award ceremonies. He talked about more authentic things like citizenship and talking about teaching the whole child, and so that would involve broadening our definition of success, bringing in other areas that children are successful at. I've taught many children that were extremely talented in other ways, but were not considered traditional school smart. And what I think is really unfortunate is that so many of those children have to leave school before they can find their passion or their element. For too long, many children go to school and are just told for 12 years how stupid they are. And no wonder so many of them quit or become disconnected. I want to rethink award ceremonies so that we start to bring all children in so that all kids feel like they belong. When you have an award ceremony that only invites back 1/3 of the school for the awards, the other 2/3 are excluded. And how, what does that say to them? I mean, in many ways, it says you're not really recognizable, and you kind of don't belong here.
Folks, we're gonna just jump to a real quick break here, guys. We'll be back in just a second to wrap up the discussion. Stay with us.
I'm all for abolishing the honor roll system and awards ceremony because I don't think it fosters a welcome learning environment for kids. In sports, sure, absolutely it makes sense, but in setting apart these ceremonies to academically award kids something, it doesn't, I don't think it bodes well for their confidence, and I don't think that it really shows that kids have individual learning styles and that they should be awarded on their individual successes. Every kid has a different way of learning, and we should all recognize that.
I want to touch briefly, we're almost out of time, guys. The no zero policy in Edmonton. This was a policy that was implemented by the Edmonton Public School Board. It has since been retracted. Clearly, somebody thought at some point it had some merit. Doctor, is there merit in a no zero policy? If you miss an assignment, I mean, clearly you're not interested.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I'm not a fan of any blanket absolute policy. Absolute 0, absolute 100, whatever, because quite honestly, nobody's perfect either way. So I think there's an argument to be made that, absolutes are not the way we want to go. I think the thinking behind the 0% policy or no zero policy is that we're going to hound kids until they submit work, and we're going to pursue them. We're going to get something from them. And I think the underlying intention is good, but again, it's one of those kind of situations where educators hear this, and particularly parents hear this, and they go back to what Joe said earlier. My experience in school was not like that. There's no such thing as, if you didn't hand something in, you got a 0. That's the way it is. And going beyond the simple fact of, it's not just a 0 that they would get incomplete or something like that. People don't make that second leap past that second part of the story, which is it's not just no zeros. It's actually what we're saying is we want to make sure students are being evaluated on what they actually know. A 0% policy or no zeros policy suggests that you know nothing, right?
But I mean, as a teacher, though, teachers have a tough time as it is. I mean, Joe, you can probably attest to it, of course. Yeah. But it needs to be a tool, does it not, to ensure that students are submitting assignments so you know exactly what they know.
I just think that for the kids who maybe aren't as organized or maybe not lazy, but just don't want to hand that in, I don't think it sends the right message, especially for the kids who have maybe put aside time and worked on an assignment, and perhaps it's not really testing the knowledge that they do have. The kid might have it, but he just didn't want to, like, who's to say he just didn't want to hand it in because he's not organized or something else came
I think
up,
there should be some structure. Joe, your thoughts, what do you think?
Well, assessment is a whole other show, but
we're actually only got about 30 seconds here, Joe. Bear with me.
I've come to see that children should experience their successes and failures not as reward and punishment, but as information, which basically means teachers and parents need to be less like referees and more like coaches. So we need to give them feedbacks to help them improve. I've known too many kids that, when I used to assign grades, because I don't anymore, I've actually abolished them from my classroom, and I only give feedback. But I know too many kids that finally said, give me a 0, I don't care.
Fair enough.
At that point, the system we can't quit on those kids.
No, you're right. I think that's if there's anything we're going to take away from this discussion, absolutely cannot quit on any of these kids. Absolutely. Guys, I want to thank you all very much for joining us. Folks, that's it for tonight. Always an informative discussion. You can keep the conversation going on Facebook as well as Twitter. If you have a topic you'd like us to discuss, don't be a stranger. Drop us a line. Thanks again and take care.